The greatest revolutions never begin with a weapon. They begin with something so ordinary that no one notices until it changes the world. The grand hall of culinary harmony shimmered beneath towering crystal vaults that captured the light of 3 distant suns and scattered it across thousands of polished dining tables like liquid starlight. Every chair was occupied. Every guest sat perfectly upright. Every silver utensil rested at precisely the same angle. The soft chime announcing the first course echoed through the immense chamber with mathematical precision, and within a single heartbeat, every diner lifted the first spoon in flawless unison. The aroma that drifted through the hall was technically perfect. Each molecule had been measured, balanced, and approved by generations of culinary scientists. Temperature varied by less than half a degree from bowl to bowl. Nutrition scores reached the highest standard ever recorded. Yet as Supreme Royal Chef Elora quietly observed the room from behind the translucent serving station, something invisible settled heavily inside her chest. Thousands of distinguished guests consumed the magnificent meal without a single genuine smile. No conversations drifted between neighboring tables. No child laughed. No elder closed their eyes in quiet appreciation. They simply finished the course, placed each spoon back onto the table with identical movements, and waited silently for the next serving. Efficiency had conquered flavor. Precision had replaced memory. The applause that followed lasted exactly 6 seconds because tradition required 6 seconds. Then silence returned once more. Elora lowered her golden eyes toward the steaming bowl resting in her own hands. She knew every ingredient by heart. She had spent years mastering molecular gastronomy, atmospheric fermentation, quantum spice stabilization, and thermal flavor harmonics. She had received every honor the Imperial Academy could bestow before reaching the equivalent of 27 Earth years. Her portrait decorated classrooms across the planet. Young chefs memorized her techniques. Foreign ambassadors requested audiences simply to taste her creations. Yet she could not remember the last time anyone had described one of her meals as comforting. The word barely existed in her language anymore. Behind her, polished service drones floated silently through hidden corridors carrying identical dishes toward identical tables, while invisible climate systems maintained the perfect humidity for maximum flavor preservation. Nothing ever failed. Nothing ever surprised anyone. One elderly historian slowly approached the serving platform after the ceremony concluded. His formal robes reflected pale silver beneath the vaulted ceiling. He bowed respectfully before speaking in a voice softened by age. "Your execution was flawless, Chef Elora," she answered with the customary smile expected of her rank. "Thank you for honoring today's banquet." The historian hesitated for only a moment before adding something that almost no citizen would dare admit aloud. "I remember stories from ancient records. They claimed meals once created memories instead of merely satisfying biological requirements." Before Elora could ask another question, attendants politely escorted the old scholar away as the hall transitioned into its next carefully scheduled event. His quiet words lingered long after the enormous chamber had emptied. Meals created memories. The sentence echoed strangely against everything she had been taught. Later that evening, she wandered alone through the Imperial Archive, where forgotten civilizations were cataloged with obsessive precision. Millions of cultural records glowed across suspended crystal shelves. One classified Earth file caught her attention. Human domestic cooking. Emotional attachment associated with shared meals. Family recipe traditions. Culinary practices lacking measurable efficiency, yet demonstrating extraordinary long-term social cohesion. Elora stared at the final annotation until the lights dimmed for night cycle. The report concluded with a sentence no scientific committee had ever successfully explained. Humans often believe the most important ingredient could not be measured. For the first time in her celebrated career, the greatest chef on her planet questioned whether perfection had quietly stolen something infinitely more valuable. The transport descended through layers of pale morning cloud until the blue curve of Earth filled the observation window. Elora remained perfectly still as countless shades of green, silver rivers, and scattered city lights emerged beneath her. According to every official briefing she had studied, this young world excelled at improvisation, tolerated inefficiency, and attached irrational emotional significance to ordinary customs. None of those reports explained why she found herself unable to stop staring at the sunrise spreading across the horizon. It looked imperfect. The clouds refused symmetry. The oceans reflected light differently every second. Somehow, that only made the planet more beautiful. Her assignment authorized 6 Earth weeks of cultural culinary research under diplomatic anonymity. No royal insignia. No ceremonial escort. No academic delegation. She would simply become another traveler searching for knowledge. The shuttle settled quietly outside a modest coastal town where narrow streets carried the scent of fresh bread, roasted coffee, rain-soaked pavement, and flowering trees. Elora paused as the air touched her face. It was full of aromas that collided instead of cooperating. Warm butter drifted beside sea salt. Sweet fruit mingled with charcoal smoke. Fresh herbs interrupted both without warning. By every standard she had mastered, the atmosphere was chaotic. Yet she found herself taking another slow breath. Her destination was not a famous culinary institute or a celebrated luxury restaurant. Instead, hidden between a bookstore and a family-owned flower shop, stood a small corner restaurant with a weathered wooden sign that simply read Carter's Kitchen. The windows were clear enough to reveal an open dining room where only 8 tables waited beneath hanging lamps. Nothing about the place suggested greatness. A handwritten chalkboard announced today's soup beside homemade bread. 2 elderly neighbors were already laughing over steaming mugs. A young mother carefully cooled a spoonful before offering it to her smiling daughter. Nobody rushed. Nobody measured conversation. Every sound blended naturally with the soft clatter of dishes and quiet music drifting from an old radio behind the counter. Elora stepped inside. The first thing she noticed was not the food. It was the silence between people that somehow felt warm instead of empty. Behind the counter stood Owen Carter, sleeves rolled above his forearms, carefully stirring a large stockpot with a wooden spoon worn smooth by years of use. His movements carried confidence without performance. He tasted the broth, frowned thoughtfully, reached for a handful of chopped parsley, stirred again, then smiled almost to himself before serving the waiting bowl. He never consulted a digital display. No holographic measurements hovered above the ingredients. There were no precision drones or molecular analyzers. Only careful attention. Only experience. Elora watched as he greeted every customer by name. He remembered who preferred less pepper, who recently welcomed a grandson, who had been recovering from surgery, and who always ordered pie after finishing soup. The recipes remained the same, yet every plate seemed quietly different because every person receiving it was different. When the morning rush finally slowed, Owen noticed the unfamiliar visitor still standing near the entrance. He wiped his hands on a clean kitchen towel and offered an easy smile that carried neither curiosity nor suspicion. "First time here?" he asked. Elora nodded once. "I have traveled a very long way to learn how humans cook." Owen laughed softly, believing it was simply the remark of an enthusiastic tourist. "Then you came to the right place," he said. "Around here, the recipes matter. But they are never the first thing we learn." The following morning arrived wrapped in a veil of mist drifting inland from the ocean, softening the edges of every rooftop until the town seemed painted in watercolor instead of brick and wood. Elora unlocked the restaurant before sunrise exactly as Owen had shown her the evening before. She expected instructions waiting on a digital terminal or a carefully organized schedule listing every task by priority. Instead, she found only a handwritten note resting beside the coffee grinder. It read, "Fresh bread first. Everything else can wait." She studied the sentence for several seconds. In her world, nothing waited. Every action existed inside a perfect sequence calculated to maximize efficiency. Here, a loaf of bread somehow came before everything else. The kitchen slowly awakened with familiar sounds that somehow felt completely unfamiliar to her. Butter melted with a gentle hiss inside a warm pan. Fresh rosemary released its fragrance beneath the edge of Owen's knife. Dough rested beneath a clean towel instead of inside a climate-controlled chamber. Steam curled upward in uneven ribbons as sunlight slipped through the front windows, filling floating flour with tiny points of gold. Owen handed Elora a simple wooden bowl filled with onions, carrots, and celery. "Would you chop these?" he asked. She nodded confidently, producing a compact precision blade from her travel kit. Before she could activate it, Owen smiled and gently shook his head. "Try this instead." He placed an ordinary kitchen knife in her hand. The handle carried years of wear, polished smooth by countless meals. "It is not perfectly balanced," Elora observed. "Neither am I," Owen replied with a quiet laugh. "We still manage." She began cutting exactly as she had been trained, every slice identical, every angle mathematically exact. Owen watched for a moment before saying nothing at all. He simply continued stirring the soup while greeting the first customers arriving through the front door. An older man entered carrying yesterday's newspaper tucked beneath his arm. Owen poured coffee before the man even reached his chair. A young nurse hurried inside wearing the tired smile of someone ending a long night shift. Without asking, Owen wrapped a warm breakfast sandwich for her to take along. A little boy proudly presented a drawing of the restaurant made with colored pencils. Owen studied it as though it belonged inside a museum before pinning it beside dozens of other children's pictures already decorating the wall. Elora quietly measured each interaction in her mind. None of them improved cooking efficiency. None increased profit. Yet every customer walked away smiling before tasting a single bite. During the slower hours, Owen invited her to sample the soup. She lifted the spoon carefully, analyzing aroma, texture, temperature, and seasoning almost automatically. The salt concentration is inconsistent, she said honestly. The vegetables are not uniform in size. The herbs were added at slightly different intervals. Owen nodded. You are right. She blinked, surprised by the easy admission. Then why not correct those flaws? He looked through the dining room where neighbors greeted one another across tables, and sunlight warmed the windows overlooking the quiet street. Because I was busy listening when Mrs. Henderson told me her husband finally came home from the hospital. I forgot the timer by almost a minute. Elora frowned gently. That reduced culinary precision. Owen smiled as he filled another bowl. Maybe, but it reminded her somebody cared enough to remember. He carried the meal to the elderly woman, setting it down with a warm, "Welcome back." Tears shimmered briefly in her eyes before she thanked him. She tasted the first spoonful, closed her eyes, and whispered, "It tastes like home." Elora lowered her own spoon in silence. Every instrument inside her analytical mind searched for a measurable explanation. None appeared. There was no scientific unit for home, no universal formula for comfort, no equation describing why one imperfect bowl of soup could change the expression on a stranger's face. For the first time since leaving her planet, she suspected the lesson she had crossed the stars to discover had never been hidden inside the recipe at all. Rain arrived just after noon, tapping gently against the restaurant windows with a steady rhythm that blended into the quiet conversations filling the dining room. The gray sky softened the sunlight until every wooden table glowed with a warm amber hue beneath the hanging lamps. Owen stood beside the stove preparing another pot of soup, while Elora carefully copied each movement into a small notebook she had purchased from the bookstore next door. The pages already contained measurements, temperatures, preparation times, and ingredient combinations, yet she sensed those details explained only a fraction of what unfolded inside this modest kitchen every day. A delivery driver entered carrying 2 heavy boxes of fresh vegetables, his jacket soaked from the rain. Before discussing invoices or supplies, Owen handed him a steaming mug of coffee and a slice of warm apple bread. The man accepted both with a grateful smile that reached his tired eyes. They spoke for only a minute about his daughter's school concert before he returned to work carrying noticeably lighter shoulders than when he had arrived. Elora quietly recorded another observation. Food often appeared before business. During the afternoon, an unexpected rush filled every table. A local youth baseball team crowded into the restaurant after practice, dripping rainwater across the entrance floor while laughing louder than the small room seemed capable of containing. Parents followed behind them, apologizing for the noise. Owen only laughed and pulled extra chairs from storage. The kitchen suddenly became a whirlwind of sizzling pans, bubbling soup, toasted sandwiches, fresh salads, and homemade desserts. Elora instinctively reached for the most efficient sequence, arranging every plate according to size and preparation time. Owen glanced at her organized line of finished meals before gently moving 2 bowls from the front of the counter. "These first," he said. She looked toward the table he indicated. An elderly couple sat quietly by the window. "Those meals were ordered later," she replied. Owen nodded. "Yes, but they have an appointment at the hospital in 20 minutes. Elora paused. Her calculations had not included someone's afternoon schedule or hidden worries. She watched the elderly man carefully help his wife stand after finishing lunch. Both thanked Owen by name before leaving beneath a shared umbrella. Nothing in her culinary education had ever suggested that kindness could influence serving order. Later, while washing dishes together, she finally asked the question that had followed her since arriving on Earth. "How do you decide what matters most?" Owen dried another plate before answering. Some days the recipe matters most. Some days the timing matters most. But on every day, the person matters most. His voice remained calm, almost effortless, as though he were describing something too obvious to require explanation. Elora stared into the sink where warm water carried away tiny fragments of herbs and flour. On my world, she said quietly, every meal is judged by technical perfection. Owen rested the towel across his shoulder and smiled with gentle understanding. There is nothing wrong with excellence. But excellence is not the same thing as hospitality. The sentence lingered between them while rain continued tapping softly against the windows. Just before closing time, a young girl entered with a handful of wildflowers gathered after the storm. Without saying a word, she placed them inside an empty glass jar on the counter. These are for everyone, she said before running back outside to join her father. Owen positioned the flowers where every customer could see them. The room instantly felt brighter, although the weather had not changed. Elora looked around the restaurant once more. She finally understood that this place was not held together by recipes, equipment, or even remarkable cooking. It was held together by hundreds of quiet choices that no award committee would ever notice. Each smile, each remembered name, each warm bowl served at exactly the right moment formed an invisible ingredient that transformed ordinary food into something no instrument on her home world had ever learned to measure. The calendar above the pantry door quietly marked the passing of another 3 weeks, though Elora hardly noticed the dates anymore. She had begun measuring time differently. One morning was remembered because Mr. Collins finally laughed after months of eating alone. Another afternoon stood out because a little girl proudly learned how to knead bread beside Owen without covering herself entirely in flour. Every day carried a story, and every story somehow found its way into the food leaving the kitchen. The notebook Elora had brought from her world looked very different now. The first pages remained filled with exact temperatures, ingredient ratios, and preparation times. The later pages contained observations that no academy on her home planet would have accepted as scientific. Ask about their family before taking the order. Fresh bread smells strongest during difficult conversations. Sit beside someone who is eating alone if the dining room is quiet. Never rush the last cup of coffee when two old friends have not seen each other in years. She read those sentences repeatedly, wondering why they felt more valuable than any culinary formula she had ever mastered. One cool Saturday evening, the restaurant closed earlier than usual. Owen switched off the glowing sign outside, locked the front door, and carried 2 steaming bowls to the small table beside the kitchen window. Rain clouds drifted across the distant shoreline, while soft jazz floated from the old radio. There were no customers left, no schedules to follow, and no urgency pressing against the evening. Owen placed one bowl before Elora. This recipe belonged to my mother, he said. She studied the simple meal. Chicken soup, fresh herbs, carrots, onions, celery, homemade noodles. Nothing appeared extraordinary. She tasted a spoonful slowly. The flavors were gentle rather than dramatic, balanced without trying to impress anyone. Yet an unexpected warmth lingered long after she swallowed. It is peaceful, she said, searching for the closest word her translator could provide. Owen smiled quietly. That is exactly how she wanted people to feel. He reached into an old wooden cabinet and carefully removed a weathered notebook bound with faded blue cloth. The edges were softened by decades of use. Several pages carried tiny stains from flour, butter, and coffee. A pressed autumn leaf rested between 2 handwritten recipes. Elora accepted the notebook with remarkable care, almost afraid the fragile paper might crumble in her hands. These measurements are incomplete, she observed. Owen nodded. Some were never written down. She looked up in confusion. Then how does anyone repeat the recipe accurately? He gently tapped the center of the notebook with one finger. Because the important part was never on the page. He explained that his mother always watched the people around her before she started cooking. If someone looked exhausted, she added an extra loaf of bread. If neighbors arrived unexpectedly, she stretched the soup instead of turning anyone away. If a child celebrated a birthday, dessert appeared whether it had been planned or not. The recipes changed because people changed. The goal was never perfect consistency. The goal was making everyone at the table feel welcome. Elora turned another page, discovering short handwritten notes between ordinary instructions. For rainy afternoons. Your father likes extra pepper. Make this when someone needs hope. She fell silent. Those tiny sentences carried more emotion than all the culinary textbooks stored inside the Imperial Archive. Owen closed the notebook gently and slid it across the table toward her. I think it has another journey left in it, he said. Elora immediately shook her head. It is your family's history. It is, Owen replied softly. And history stays alive when somebody chooses to carry it forward. She looked down at the worn blue cover resting beneath her hands. For the first time since leaving home, she realized she was no longer searching for the greatest recipe on earth. She had found something far rarer. She had found a way of feeding hearts before feeding hunger, and she wondered whether an entire civilization could learn that lesson from one ordinary notebook that still smelled faintly of flour and home. The return voyage felt far shorter than the journey that had first carried Elora toward Earth, although nothing about the distance between the stars had changed. She spent most of the flight sitting beside the observation window with the faded blue recipe notebook resting carefully on her lap. Outside, galaxies drifted past in silent rivers of light. Inside, she read the handwritten pages again and again, pausing not at the ingredient lists but at the small notes hidden between them. Add another loaf if unexpected guests arrive. Save the last slice for someone who looks lonely. Cook slowly when the weather turns cold. None of those instructions belonged in a professional culinary manual, yet they lingered in her thoughts far longer than any precise measurement ever had. When her shuttle finally descended through the shimmering atmosphere of her home world, the familiar skyline rose beneath clouds of silver mist. Towering kitchens crowned the capital like monuments to flawless engineering. Every preparation center remained immaculate. Every delivery drone followed identical flight paths. Every public dining hall operated exactly as it had before she departed. Nothing appeared different, yet Elora knew she no longer saw the city with the same eyes. Within 2 days, she resumed her position inside the Imperial Culinary Complex. News of her research mission had spread quickly, and the High Council requested a demonstration featuring the most valuable discoveries from Earth. Hundreds of observers gathered behind transparent gallery walls while culinary scholars activated recording systems capable of preserving every movement with microscopic precision. Elora prepared the familiar soup exactly as she had learned beside Owen. Fresh vegetables simmered gently. Herbs released their fragrance into the warm air. Homemade noodles floated across the surface of the broth. She followed every written instruction with extraordinary care, refusing assistance from automated preparation systems. When the bowls were finally served, silence filled the chamber as the council members tasted the meal. After several long moments, the chief examiner placed his spoon neatly beside the bowl. The nutritional profile is excellent, he announced. Another official nodded. Texture is satisfactory. A third reviewed analytical data projected above the table. Flavor harmony exceeds current planetary standards by 3.8%. Their evaluations continued for several minutes. Efficient, balanced, technically impressive. Every compliment sounded strangely familiar. Every face remained unchanged. No one smiled. No one asked for another serving. No one looked toward the person sitting beside them. Elora lowered her gaze to the untouched notebook lying beside the stove. A quiet disappointment settled over the room, not because the food had failed, but because something essential had never arrived with it. That evening, she walked alone through the nearly empty training kitchens where young apprentice chefs practiced perfect knife techniques beneath bright white lights. Every student copied recipes with flawless discipline. Every instructor corrected measurements within fractions of a gram. Watching them, Elora suddenly understood the mistake she had made. She had carried home the recipe, but not the reason the recipe existed. The notebook had never promised to teach kindness. It had only pointed toward it. The following morning, she entered the central classroom without announcing a new menu. Instead, she placed a single empty chair in the center of the room. The students exchanged puzzled glances. Elora looked around the quiet hall before speaking softly. Before anyone prepares today's meal, I want each of you to tell me who you are cooking for. Confused silence filled the room. One apprentice finally answered, for the evaluation committee. Elora smiled gently and shook her head. No, imagine one real person. Someone who is celebrating. Someone who is grieving. Someone who has traveled far from home. Someone who simply needs to know they matter. The room grew still in a way she had never witnessed before. Pens stopped moving. Screens dimmed. For the first time in generations, the lesson inside the greatest culinary academy on her planet was no longer about perfect food. It was about the people waiting beyond the kitchen doors, and Elora quietly realized that this was the true beginning of the journey she had crossed the stars to find. The new lesson spread through the Imperial Culinary Academy more quietly than Elora expected. No official proclamation appeared across the capital. No ceremonial announcement echoed through the government towers. Instead, the change began with small questions that had never been asked before. Every morning, before the first burner was lit, each apprentice now placed a blank card beside the cutting board and wrote a single sentence across the top. Who is this meal for? At first the answers sounded awkward. For my instructor. For today's evaluation. For the evening banquet. Elora simply smiled and invited them to try again. Slowly the words changed. For my grandmother who no longer enjoys eating alone. For a child. Celebrating a birthday. For a miner returning after months beneath the northern ice fields. For a nurse finishing a long overnight shift. Something subtle shifted inside the kitchens as those answers became more personal. The students still measured carefully and respected every technique, but their hands moved with a different rhythm. They paused before plating each dish, imagining the face waiting beyond the dining hall. Some added fresh herbs, because they remembered someone loved their fragrance. Others baked an extra loaf of bread without being instructed, leaving it near the entrance for late arrivals. None of those decisions improved efficiency reports, yet visitors lingered longer after meals. Conversations grew louder, and laughter occasionally echoed beneath ceilings that had once reflected only silence. Not everyone welcomed the transformation. Several senior examiners questioned Elora during a formal review session inside the council chamber. Crystal displays projected declining production statistics, while analytical graphs compared the previous year's flawless consistency with the new approach. One official adjusted his spectacles and spoke with measured concern. Chef Elora, your students are spending additional time speaking with guests before preparing meals. Output has fallen by 4%. Another added, some recipes now vary slightly, depending on individual circumstances. Standardization is becoming increasingly difficult. Elora listened without interruption. When they finished, she placed a small wooden spoon on the polished conference table. It was the same spoon Owen had quietly slipped into her travel bag before she left Earth, its smooth surface marked by years of ordinary use. Against the brilliant crystal surroundings, it looked almost insignificant. May I ask each of you one question? She said calmly. The council members nodded. Can any of your graphs measure whether someone leaves the table feeling less alone than when they arrived? Silence settled across the chamber. No display offered an answer. No algorithm illuminated the air. The discussion ended without resolution, yet the council did not order her methods to stop. Weeks became months, and the first signs of change appeared far beyond the academy walls. Families who had once eaten according to rigid schedules began requesting shared tables. Public dining halls quietly rearranged seating so strangers could face one another instead of identical screens displaying nutritional information. Elderly citizens remained after meals simply to continue conversations. Children volunteered to help prepare community dinners, laughing when flour dusted their sleeves. None of those moments had been planned by policy. They simply happened because one generation of young chefs had learned to notice the people instead of only the plates. Late one evening, after the academy had emptied, Elora unlocked the small drawer beneath her desk and opened the faded blue notebook once more. A pressed autumn leaf still rested between its worn pages. She traced the familiar handwriting with gentle fingertips before closing her eyes. Across unimaginable distances, she could almost hear the quiet sounds of a small earth kitchen, the gentle simmer of soup, the soft laughter of neighbors, and Owen's steady voice reminding her that recipes feed the body only after someone decides to care for the person waiting at the table. For the first time since returning home, she realized that the greatest lesson she carried across the stars was no longer hers alone. It had already begun finding new hands, new kitchens, and new hearts. The first harvest festival after the Academy's new curriculum began arrived beneath clear skies that reflected softly across the white stone terraces of the capital. For generations, the celebration had been admired for its flawless organization rather than remembered for any particular moment. Meals were served exactly on schedule, guests departed exactly on schedule, and every citizen returned home with identical memories of another perfect event. This year something quietly changed before the first table was even prepared. Students from the academy requested permission to arrange the dining area differently. Instead of separating families, officials, workers, and visitors into carefully ranked sections, they created long shared tables. Stretching beneath flowering trees, fresh herbs and handmade clay pots replaced polished crystal decorations. Warm bread rested in woven baskets placed within everyone's reach instead of being distributed by automated service units. Several council members exchanged uncertain glances, but no regulation specifically prohibited such an arrangement. As the festival began, Elora walked slowly through the gathering without wearing the ceremonial robes expected of the royal chef. She preferred the simple cream-colored apron she had adopted during her weeks on Earth. Around her, apprentices greeted arriving guests by name whenever they could. When they did not know someone's name, they asked with genuine interest instead of scanning an identification record. The difference seemed almost invisible, yet the atmosphere felt unlike any celebration the capital had experienced before. An elderly musician who usually performed alone was invited to share a meal with a family whose youngest child eagerly asked about instruments from earlier centuries. A group of engineers paused their discussion of production statistics long enough to compliment the garden maintained by a retired botanist seated nearby. Two strangers discovered they had grown up in neighboring districts, but had never spoken despite living on the same planet for decades. Conversations crossed the length of every table like gentle streams finding one another after a long journey. The food itself remained beautifully prepared, but for the first time people lingered after finishing their meals. They exchanged recipes inherited from grandparents, shared childhood memories, and laughed over small mistakes made while learning to cook. The sound surprised many of the older citizens because laughter had never before become the defining memory of a public banquet. Near sunset, the High Chancellor quietly approached Elora carrying a simple bowl of vegetable soup prepared by one of the newest apprentices. He tasted a spoonful before looking across the crowded terraces where hundreds of guests continued talking beneath strings of glowing lanterns. "The recipe is uncomplicated," he observed. Elora nodded gently. "It is." He sampled another spoonful in thoughtful silence. "Yet this may be the finest festival our capital has ever hosted." She smiled, understanding he was speaking about far more than the meal itself. As evening settled over the city, children gathered empty baskets while volunteers wrapped extra bread and fresh fruit for elderly neighbors unable to attend the celebration. Nobody had ordered them to do so. They simply noticed there was enough to share. Elora watched quietly as the last rays of sunlight faded beyond the distant towers, and she realized the transformation had never depended upon convincing an entire civilization to change overnight. It had begun each time one person looked across a table and decided another person's comfort mattered. She slipped the worn blue notebook from her satchel and opened it to the page marked by the pressed autumn leaf. Beneath her own careful handwriting, she added one final sentence inspired by everything she had witnessed that day. A recipe becomes tradition only after kindness invites someone else to the table. She closed the notebook with a peaceful smile, knowing that somewhere across the stars, in a small restaurant filled with the familiar scent of fresh bread and simmering soup, Owen would probably say that was never really a lesson about cooking at all. Nearly 5 Earth years passed before the Council of Worlds requested permission to study the remarkable social transformation unfolding across Elora's civilization. Statistical reports could explain only part of the story. Public health had improved because more citizens chose to eat together instead of alone. Volunteer kitchens had appeared in every major city without government orders. Festivals that once lasted a few carefully scheduled hours had become evenings filled with music, conversation, and families lingering beneath lanterns long after the final meal. The greatest surprise was not found inside the reports, but inside the language itself. A new expression had quietly entered everyday speech. Instead of wishing someone an efficient meal, citizens now wished one another a table worth remembering. Historians searched ancient archives and confirmed that no comparable phrase had existed for centuries. During the opening ceremony of the newly founded Academy of Shared Tables, thousands gathered beneath a glass dome overlooking the capital. Students from every province carried simple wooden bowls instead of ceremonial crystal vessels, honoring the idea that a meal belonged first to the people sharing it, not to the objects surrounding it. The High Chancellor stepped forward before the assembled crowd and announced that the Academy would permanently replace the former Imperial Institute of Culinary Optimization. Its new mission would be simple: teach every chef to understand the person before perfecting the recipe. As applause echoed across the plaza, Elora remained quietly near the back of the stage. She had been offered the title of Supreme Culinary Chancellor, the highest honor her profession could bestow. She accepted only after making one unusual request. Every graduate would spend part of their education serving ordinary neighborhoods before entering royal kitchens. The council agreed without hesitation. Excellence would now begin with service instead of status. Several months later, a diplomatic shuttle departed for Earth carrying no weapons, no trade demands, and no political negotiations. Inside a carefully protected case rested the faded blue notebook wrapped in fresh linen. Elora insisted on returning it herself. When she stepped once again through the familiar doorway of Carter's kitchen, the little bell above the entrance rang with the same gentle sound she remembered. The walls displayed new children's drawings beside older ones faded by sunlight. The wooden counter held fresh bread cooling beside the window. Owen looked up from the stove, smiled with quiet surprise, and welcomed her as though only a few days had passed. Without ceremony, she placed the notebook beside him. "It belongs here," she said softly. Owen rested his hand on the worn cover, but did not open it immediately. "Did it help?" he asked. Elora looked through the dining room, where neighbors laughed over steaming bowls, while strangers slowly became friends across shared tables. She smiled in exactly the way she never could before leaving. Her homeworld. "No," she answered gently. "People helped. The notebook simply reminded us how." Before sunset, she invited Owen outside. Waiting above the harbor hovered a peaceful convoy of silver starships unlike any Earth had ever seen. Their cargo bays slowly opened, not to reveal machines or treasures, but thousands of small wooden tables handcrafted across her world. Each table carried a brass plaque engraved with the same quiet sentence in 2 languages. "This table exists because one human believed every meal should make someone feel at home." Years later, travelers arriving on Elora's planet no longer remembered it as the civilization with the most perfect food. They remembered it as the place where strangers were always invited to sit together. And beneath the oldest flowering tree outside the Academy of Shared Tables stood a weathered wooden spoon sealed inside clear crystal, illuminated by the evening light. Children often asked why such an ordinary object occupied the Academy's place of honor. Their teachers always gave the same answer: because that spoon stirred the first recipe that reminded an entire world how to care for one another.